It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Sabina Dewan, and I'm the President and Executive Director of the Just Jobs Network, a global research organization that focuses on employment, workforce development, and governance of labor markets. We live in very unprecedented times right now. Forces like technology and pandemics and trade shocks, climate change, the energy transition, all of these different forces are completely upending the way that we live and work. And among these different forces, technology is, of course, a very, very powerful one. And to those that say that we've had waves of technology before and we humans have always managed fine, I would say that the speed and the scale of the current wave of technological advancement far exceeds anything that we have experienced before. And that these changes are happening faster than the ability of institutions, policies, regulations, and people to keep up. One facet of this technology is the proliferation of platforms. Digital platforms are becoming the architecture for economic transactions. And there are many kinds of platforms, but among these, digital labor platforms are those that act as intermediaries, connecting service providers, which is a worker that provides a particular service, with consumers that are either individuals or businesses that want to avail that service. A unique characteristic of the platform economy is that the worker or service provider that is delivering the service is not an employee of the platform, but is a self-employed contract worker who is responsible for their own labor and social protections, for their social security and insurance. Increasingly, we see that businesses, from logistics businesses, food delivery, transport, to back office operations, spanning legal services, spanning human resource services, they're all starting increasingly to rely on this kind of digital platform mediation and on these self-employed contract or what are otherwise called gig workers. This has implications for the employment relationship, for conditions of work, for social protection systems, and more broadly, how we transact in our economies. And so to unpack this very far-reaching, rapidly growing phenomenon, and to discuss the implications of the proliferation of digital labor platforms, today we have four very distinguished speakers with us. I will introduce all the panelists at once and then go to each of them for questions to go deeper into the conversation. So we have Jonathan Stöterau, who is an economist with the World Bank. We have Sai Amulya Komarraju, who is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. We have Dovev Lavie, who's a professor at Bocconi University. And we have Clairy Moraitou, who is the group head of customer insights at Zurich Insurance. Thank you all for joining us. It's a privilege to be here with such a diversity of expertise and perspectives. So Jonathan, let me first start with you. As I mentioned, the platform economy and digital platforms are increasingly becoming the architecture for economic transactions. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities of this unfolding trend? And what are the economic, ethical considerations and the rationale for regulation? Over to you, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you very much, Serena, for the very nice introductions. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, as you said, across the various different time zones. Yes, I think I want to talk a bit about what are the differences between developing countries and developed countries, as they're often called. Um, and how can we ensure that like these platforms can kind of create employment in developing countries by while at the same time, we ensure that they still provide decent work and social security for the workers. And I think I would like to make like three main contexts or like three main points very briefly in the next 4 or 5 minutes. So the first one is really context matters. We really need to understand that the developing countries need tailored approaches that reflect their economic realities. The second one is there's very little evidence and very little regulation so far in most of the developing countries that we work in. So we have opportunity to design regulation from first principles. But because of this lack of evidence, we need to form like a gradual and an experimental approach, um, because it's really difficult to find the right balance between protection and job creation and really requires a careful calibration. So just briefly to come to the first point on this contextual thing. Regulations really need to account for the context in which they operate. And in developing countries, gig work is already the reality for many workers. So there's very little formal work. It's concentrated in very few large public sector companies. There's just job scarcity or labor abundance. And the majority of people work in self-employment or own account work. And they have multiple small little gig jobs already. Not where, as in gig jobs, I'm not referring to platform work, but really like these small short-term jobs in the informal economy. And most of the labor markets in developing countries um, are hampered by information frictions and by market failures. So there's a very inefficient labor and product markets often. So in this context, platform gig work or platform work can really present an alternative to informality rather than disrupt formal jobs that already exist in the economy. They can reduce information asymmetry, standardized products. They can overcome a lack of labor demand by providing demand from outside the country. And that means, and I think is one of the main important parts here, is that regulatory approaches that have developed in developing countries, and are relevant and important there in high income countries may actually destroy job opportunities in developing countries. So of course this doesn't mean that we don't need regulations, right? We still need regulations, but we need to design them, or we have the chance to design them from a very different point of view. Um, So the existing regulatory approaches, and this is kind of like the second part, the first principles approach, the existing regulatory approaches have been developed in high income countries, are often based on this traditional employer-employee relationship. And there's been a lot of discussions around, do we want to classify platform gig workers as employees or as independent workers? It's a huge discussion. I'm not going to go into this. Um, but the question is, does the same approach make sense in developing countries? Um, and here again, the evidence and the experience of this is very limited. So what do I mean by these first principles? It's we have like the we can rethink what regulatory approaches mean. So these platform-specific risks, such as exploitation, algorithms, algorithmic biases, data privacy, um, these platform-specific risks need platform-specific regulations. So we can explore more innovative approaches for regulation and social protections since we have a clean slate in many countries. And that requires us to really rethink the fundamentals on focusing on the desired protections, not existing categories or classifications of workers. Um, And with this in mind, how can we approach this? And I kind of would argue for like a gradual approach that balances workers' protections with employment generation. So first we start off with like a minimum set of regulations and social protections that are based in key principles of fair treatment, fair contribution, and that address these platform-specific risks such as data privacy, portability, algorithmic management. And that allows us to use the visibility of platform work. So because workers that have been informally in the informal economy before um, are now registering on the platform and they are visible to an extent because we have some data on them to enforce basic standards that they didn't have in the informal economy. At the same time, we don't want to drive them working underground again, right? We want them to give them the opportunity to go on a platform and have this work opportunity that is often even better than what they work in the informal economy. Um, so we can start by establishing minimum standards regardless of classification, and then we gradually expand this from a minimal to a comprehensive approach as productivity rises and as these platforms become um, more established. These standards can be progressively improved, uh, and especially in this part, it's very important to gather evidence, gather experience with this to learn what works. And here, the opportunity that we have is that platforms generate a lot of data, um, and we can use this data to test and inform policies, to really test innovative approaches to regulation, um, maybe even on specific platforms, partnering with the platforms, and seeing how they work and what works,
Uh,
and then
Jonathan,
expand.
I'm sorry,
Yes,
I'm going to have to interrupt you
I'm
because we
ending
have
here.
a
That was my
short
last
session.
point.
Yes, please.
That was my
If you
last point. And so,
okay.
yeah, that would be my main point. And I'm ending here. That was exactly the point.
Perfect. I think ending on the note of platforms collecting data and the importance of how it can inform evidence-based policymaking, I think is a really interesting one. And also the distinction that you made between sort of labor markets in the global south and the global north, and the variations in the structures of economies and how they lend themselves to an iterative approach to regulation, I think is uh, very a very insightful conversation to I think, to set the stage for our next speaker. Sai, if I could turn to you next. Jonathan sort of paved the way for us to talk about the Global South a little bit, and I'd like to continue on that line of conversation. So, in platform economies, especially in the Global South, what does designing for fairness and economic justice really look like? If I could turn to you next.
Right. Thank you so much, Sabina. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Also, thanks to Jonathan because you've set the context for what I'm going to say. So, let me get right into it. My work is informed by feminist theory. And I want to begin with what might sound abstract: an ethic of care and empathy in platform design, specifically digital labor platforms, for economic justice and dignity. But I'll ground this in concrete examples. So, most debates on platform economies start with the status of workers. They're neither fully self employed nor employees, neither completely independent nor completely subordinate. Similarly, platforms in themselves are neither intermediaries nor employers, and platforms replace the standard employment contract with a triangular relationship between the worker, the platform, and the customer. So, in this gray zone, especially in the global south, work is reduced to little more than demand and supply for services. But our digital labor platforms, especially those that offer care services, are they really in the business of demand and supply? Now, this ambiguity isn't accidental, it's deliberate. The gray zone helps platform businesses avoid recognizing any social form of employment. Terms and conditions can be tweaked and rights can continue to remain elusive. In the global south, the problem is magnified because of history. Labor systems were shaped by colonial extraction. So we have many laws that exist on paper, but enforcement is lacking. And protections rarely extend beyond large enterprises. arises. So this is why ethical dumping that we call, right, work that wouldn't meet labor standards in the West, they land on global South workers. So any regulations framed for platform economy will need teething. So these historical and structural legacies, they shape how we see women workers. Social norms in general still cast women as mothers and sisters rather than workers. Our dominant understanding of who counts as a worker, what work is, and what normal working hours are is built on the logic of masculinity. So care is either naturalized as woman's nature to nurture, as women's duty, or at best it is recognized only as women's work. So when women take up gigs like food delivery or ride hailing, they often remain invisible. And once you factor in caste and other intersectional dynamics, their lived experiences become even harder to ignore. So this is where the ethic of care becomes essential. Consider nudging, for instance. Nudging is a term borrowed from behavioral economics, right? So nudging is how businesses get people or steer people to choose something, to steer people's choices. So how do they do this? By playing on desires and emotions of people. Within platforms, AI supervision is mostly invisible. So workers who work for these platforms don't report to a human boss as such. And this creates a false sense of freedom. They feel as if they're working for themselves, they're micro entrepreneurs, but we know and they know that ratings, reviews, algorithms are quietly shaping their livelihoods. So platforms cultivate this false sense of ownership. So when things go wrong, workers don't blame the system, but they blame themselves. Indirect harms also matter. For instance, take late night incentives. Women workers quickly learn that risks of late night gigs far outweigh the rewards. A few women may own vehicles, but many do not. Some women workers in platformed beauty or care work, they rely on their husbands to escort them to high risk areas. So their ability to work depends not only on demand, but it is also dependent on family dynamics. So what looks like a choice on paper is anything but in practice. So how do we design for dignity? By acknowledging that there needs to be a transformation of the four forces of regulation that Jonathan also referred to. We talk about markets, law, architecture, and norms. So in terms of markets, we need to move from logic of extraction to empowerment. In terms of law, we need to move from paternalistic, protectionist frameworks to solidarity and social security. In terms of architecture, we need to move from manipulation and opacity to transparency. And in terms of norms, we need to move from imposed assumptions about this is how a worker is, this is what working hours are, to being context sensitive, as Jonathan mentioned. So essentially, design isn't just about technology, it's about how these four forces, market, law, architecture, norms, how they're set up to function. So designing with an ethic of care and empathy is essentially being context sensitive to ensure that there is dignity in work, dignity of work, and dignity from work. If platforms are shaping the future of labor, then our responsibility is to ensure that they also shape a future of justice and dignity. Thank you. You're on mute, Sabina.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sai, and just before time, so that was perfect. I really appreciate, as you said, Jonathan kind of set us up for the broad conversation around this economic transition that's taking place, and then, your more nuanced conversation around how the platform economy is having a differential impact, not just on global North and global South, but also on workers within the platform economy. And to truly understand how this is playing out, we need to get into the nuances and therefore, for example, the impact on women in particular and their specific set of considerations. Let me now sort of pivot a little bit, taking this context. Let me pivot towards Dovev and come to you next, Dovev. Sai talked about designing for fairness and justice. She talked about markets, laws, architecture, and norms. And Dovev, you've done some innovative work around a certification system that would create incentives for small businesses to potentially operate in an ethical and just manner, right? So going from sort of this context setting to really what are some of the innovative approaches that are emerging. And I'd love for you to now speak a little bit about your research in this regard. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and it's a pleasure joining this panel. So digital platforms are taking the lead in much of the economic activity, and my research is not limited to labor issues. I'm focusing more on the global north, US and Europe, but I think that my idea of certification is actually more applicable in the global south, as based on what Sai shared. So let me start with the problem. Digital platforms, while enhancing a lot of our abilities, access to products, services, you can say even free services, come at a cost. And we now recognize more and more the downsides of relying on the big tech platforms that are exploiting the users, the customers, the vendors, and society, and they are leveraging their access to data, to manipulate, to bias behaviors and basically benefit themselves at the expense of others. And the tool that has been used so far was regulation, antitrust, but we realized that it has limitations, and we realized that even the most recent regulation in the EU is falling short, because it either relies on recognition that the big tech are not to be touched and they need to conduct self-assessment, or the very few cases that reach the court take many years to resolve. And when we get to the finish line, we realize that these companies get away with a small fine relative to what they gained from their misconduct. Or actually we see that there is intervention, or we leave the choice to them how to resolve it, but it's too late by then. The stakeholders, the users do not benefit, the competition is gone, so this is not an effective tool. My proposal is to try to build on similar ideas like the ISO 9000 certification for quality management, or the B Corp certification for organizations that promise and deliver high levels of SDG service, and to try to apply this to the context of digital platform, not to penalize the big tech for their misconduct, but to provide positive incentives to the small platforms that would actually try to, first and foremost, serve society and act for the good. The problem is that at the moment they are disadvantaged, because the regulation, for instance, requires them to invest a lot of resources in adapting their business and adapting to regulation, which doesn't really enhance innovation or competition, and they are not being rewarded for their good conduct. To the contrary, they are disadvantaged. So if we are able to specify standards, what does it mean to good as a platform, or what kind of behaviors are unacceptable for a platform, and we have a third party, an external international organization with the right skills that cover not only legal aspects, but also business management and computer science, because these are platforms, then we can go and inspect these platforms, not only their business practices, but also their algorithms. And there are means today to go and inspect whether what the platform actually does is what they mean it and what the expectations are. Even in the current regulation, like the Digital Market Act or the Digital Services Act, there are provisions under which the regulators can go and inspect these algorithms, but this is very rare. But if we make it a default and we go and we inspect these platforms, then we can certify them and say whether they meet the certain standard. We can indicate not only whether they violated the prohibitive regulation, but also to indicate whether they are serving the stakeholders, whether they are doing good, and whether they need to adjust something, to change some of their conduct, to avoid certain nuanced misbehaviors that would not be recognized by regulation as something that would disqualify them. And this way we can provide stakeholders like employees, like customers, with some ratings, assessment to benchmark different platforms and compare and make an informed choice. And the idea is that this certification would actually allow these emerging small contenders to gain a differentiation advantage, to get recognition, reward for their good behavior, and in a way gain market share. So unlike the current regulation that is too slow and too late in trying to fix the world by penalizing misbehavior, which doesn't really bother the big tech firms, the idea here is to offer positive ex-ante incentives, adaptive, that are encouraging good behavior and rewarding it.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Dovev. I think, there are several organizations that do, the Fair Work Index, I believe, or, even trade unions or other private sector outfits that kind of look at some of the practices of platforms, but gaining access to the algorithms and gaining access to the data, as Jonathan also mentioned, is complicated because, platforms always cite competitiveness issues. But I think, the way that you have posted in terms of actually a certification process that creates these incentives so that platforms themselves would want to opt in, I think is a very interesting proposal, and one that, certainly I think could warrant a lot more conversation and discussion in trying to really think about innovative approaches to governing the platform economy. Let me now come to Clairy. Clairy, you also bring a very interesting perspective to all of these matters. I would like to focus a little bit on customer research by insurance, right? Why is customer research by insurance companies important in the future of work, especially with the rise of platform work and other diverse forms of employment? Where does insurance come in, and why is customer research in particular important in this regard?
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I think we heard a lot from Jonathan and Sai and Dovev about FAIR and ethos, right, and dignity. So, and we talked about the particularities of platform work, which on the one hand brings flexibility and opportunity, but on the other hand leaves many workers exposed, I would use the word, because they don't have predictable benefits like pensions and health insurance and public liability or income protection, and they face the risks, but they don't have the safety nets that traditional employers and employees have relied on. So that gap that's being created, which is a gap in protection, is something where insurers have a role to play and bridge the protection gap. And this means finding solutions and products that match these realities of new formats of work. And the way this can be manifested is either products for individual workers, so people take with them and they flex with their income, for example, or through collective agreements. For example, the platform operator, similar to what we do with large companies where we partner with the big employers, and we can do the same with platform operators to embed protection in the platform that the workers work every day. So the goal of insurance at this point is to make sure that all workers can protect themselves and plan for the future. So that's the context. And where does insurance, where consumer research come into play? We do extensive research and segmentation according to life stages and needs. So we see what different customers, different consumers out there want as individuals or as solo one-person companies. And we understand their needs, their fears, their aspirations, their motivations. And through that, we are able to, for example, we can see what different needs are, for example, by role. So delivery workers would fear accidents, or freelancers, they worry about the income continuity, or vehicle protection. So research helps insurers segment these needs and treat the platform workers in a bit of a differentiated way, similar to how we do with our customers. We can use research to design flexible products. For one thing that platform workers ask is always flexibility, right? And control. So we can actually think about products that are pay as you go or on off, depending on the usage, or macro insurance per trip or per hour. We're doing that in North America. Actually, we have the gig insurance, as we call it in Zurich. We can also understand the financial behavior. We know that platform workers, they have irregular income streams, right? So they prefer small payments and frequent contributions. So we need to rethink our payment structures and have perhaps payments that mirror and reflect the earning flows. One very important other thing that comes up from research is the digital expectations. We know platform workers, they want seamless, mostly digital experiences. And again, the global north, the global south has differences, as I very rightly put it out in terms of usage. But we need to have simple, seamless way to onboard workers, platform workers. We need to simplify the claims process, for example, through apps and not through painful, let's say, physical experiences. And lastly, one element that we learn from research is communication. So how do we ultimately build this trust and this relevance, which is very important for insurers in order to get continuity? We know that platform workers don't have the trust that the vast range of consumer has. How do we get there? We need to adjust our communication. So we adjust our tone of voice based on different segments, and this way we are able to, for example, use more simple language to different and more simplicity into people that don't have this financial acumen or financial comprehension that some others do, and this can help build confidence to every consumer, including platform workers, right? To feel that they can face and plan for the future and the plausible future and risks that this may bring.
So Clairy, would you, I'm just going to stick with you and come to a second question. If you could just take another couple of minutes quickly and just give us some examples of instruments that have been effective in this regard that you might have come across in your work. Examples, additional.
Yes. So everyone is still working on it. There's nobody has really mastered that, and among carriers, among insurers, I mean. But we have many examples of switched off on insurance with some companies. So really, pay as you go, let's say, schemes. We have a lot of customer experiences that go into the digital first area. So really having claims that you can totally follow the journey through an app remotely through cameras and really recording what your experience is. We have insurers that exactly offer this gig economy in insurance provision. And we, as I said, we have this in North America. We have companies. So we, for example, have partnered with a company that exactly runs as a platform for insurance for all the platform workers as an intermediary to offer insurance to the platforms out there. So there is this provision, if you like, for insurers and we are both, it's called ONZI actually, and we're both an investor and an insurance provider to this platform. And we have a lot of companies that are doing what we call embedded insurance. So really AI models doing fast underwriting to providing insurance to even tasks and not specific long-term kind of commitments. So just some ideas, but still the whole territory there is evolving and ideas are still being built.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Clairy. I think, these approaches to insurance, to certification, to thinking about, standard public regulation, government-led regulation. I think all of them are trying to also grapple with these new realities of work, which are no longer your traditional notions of 9 to 5 kind of jobs, but rather tasks, right? So what essentially labor platforms or the gig economy is doing is taking jobs and breaking them up into smaller gigs or task-oriented services, and then spreading it around more workers, right? So, it's not necessarily more job creation, but it is spreading income generation across more workers. And so all of the innovative approaches are trying to grapple with this new form of work, as it were, I think. I'd like to come back to you, Sai. And, we've sort of now heard these two innovative approaches. What, in your view, if you could just take a couple of minutes and outline what are, in your view, a couple of the top priorities to address some of the challenges that this platformization is now throwing up, right? How should those be addressed? And you can take private sector approaches, government approaches. What should the priorities be?
That's an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I'm going to go with what Jonathan has already said. Regulatory interventions are absolutely necessary. But like I said, they need teething. But the way in which platforms have been systematically dismantling collective bargaining approaches, hard-won regulatory interventions, I think the priority should be to ensure that platform workers get the status of workers, not as self-employed or as employed, because that creates the gray zone. Another way in which to approach this is for platforms in general to take a look at the philosophy or the organizational culture that they want to bring in. So most of these organizations they follow DEI regulations, but when it comes to treating platform workers, they're severely lacking. So if they can bring similar kind of approaches to how they deal with workers, and if they can look at workers as collaborators rather than somebody who's just providing a particular service, that would help mitigate a lot of stuff that is going on. But the mere fact that most of these platforms, at least in India, don't recognize unions, that's a huge red flag. And for transparency, the way in which algorithms work, workers don't understand why their rating has gone down, and there's no qualitative feedback that's given to them. Reviews usually come from customers who are not happy with a particular worker's service. So a lot of things in terms of transparency, but all of this would be tied back to laws and how platforms draft their own approach to dealing with platform workers, but also in terms of customer conscientization, especially in India, where workers are looked at as disposable, as if they don't need dignity, they don't need to be treated with respect. So social norms regarding dignity of labor, that needs to change, and to just look at workers as human beings, that would help. Might be too ideal, but that's the hope.
Well, I think if we aim high, right, at least we owe that to ourselves in terms of not just the moral imperative, but also harnessing the productive potential of workers, right?
Absolutely.
I think that's incredibly important. Dovev, I want to come to you really quickly because, several of the speakers have mentioned, access to data and, access to the algorithms. And we also have a question in the chat that was talking about the criteria for certification. Can you take both of these just a couple of minutes to tell us, do you think that, again, that businesses would be amenable? How do you gain access to those algorithms? What are the criteria for certification? I know these are big questions, but just give us a little flavor in about two to 3 minutes, please.
Okay, so first of all, the idea of certification, it's going to be voluntary. So we don't expect the big tech firms to rush to certify the businesses. They have only to lose from it. But the small tech companies, the small platforms that are trying to be more social oriented, they would have an incentive. And if they are actually serving their stakeholders, they would have nothing to hide. So they would probably be willing to provide access. And in fact, this will help build their legitimacy and build their reputation in the field. And there are standard means to protect proprietary knowledge and to deal with issues of privacy and data security as being used by some other standards like the ISO certification, etc. So this is something that is solvable. About the criteria, my suggestion is to have two types of scorecards. We can call them do no harm scorecard and do a good scorecard. And the do no harm scorecard would be based on identifying the current misconduct or kind of undesirable practices that the platforms use, like self-preferencing or violating data privacy or exposure to social harm, and trying to measure the extent to which they are prevalent in the platform using a clear set of questions. Then the do good scorecard would be based on desirable practices of how they serve the interest of stakeholders of different kinds, what their mission is, if they are mindful about environmental aspects, etc. And then the inspectors that go into the company can collect information, can ask questions, and rate these companies so that those who receive the information at the end, customers, employees, would not only get an overall rating, but will also get a very clear sense where the digital platform is performing very well and where it is deficient. And also the platform itself will get some feedback about how to improve. So there is more to it in a forthcoming paper, the Academy of Management Perspective. I provide the link so you can find information about this.
Sorry, could all the participants please mute their line? Thank you. Sorry, Dovev, please continue.
Okay, so I already exploited the time that I was allocated. I would just direct you to a forthcoming paper together with Tommaso Belletti and Oreste Pollicino that discusses this idea of certification.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. Last but not least, Jonathan, I'd like to come back to you. And now that you set us off with providing the broad context of platformization. Now I want to come back to you after you've heard, Sai's intervention about the differential impact of platforms, innovative needs for regulation of different kinds, but also approaches that Dovev and Clairy have talked about. Could you tell us what, in your view, are the 2 to 3 top priorities in terms of governing the platform economy? And then I think that you will have the last word before I close the panel. So over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sabina. And these interventions so far are really great. And I'm humbled by having the last words here with also many interesting interventions that I have to address. But maybe I think I'll just highlight two of the two things that I think, especially in the context of developing countries, looking from the World Bank perspective is really important, but also generally. And I think many of my colleagues here on the panel have highlighted this as really finding ways to support platform workers to unionize and really to recognize this unequal bargaining powers that platform workers have, and the completely new situation in which we find platform workers. So, platform workers are often they're not classified as workers. So typical antitrust laws or typical bargaining power laws don't apply to them, and they're geographically dispersed. There are many platforms in the same market, and enabling sectoral bargaining, enabling supporting workers to workers' unionization and bargaining rights is, I think, a core point to start for any regulation approaches. Um, and I think the sectoral approach where we focus on platform specific concerns and provide them with opportunities to address these concerns that they have, that must be one of the key things. And again here, and I think many of my colleagues also have addressed this, is addressing the transparency, the lack of transparency and the lack of data. So I think the second part is to develop the capacities in governance structures, in administrative oversight, to develop, to address and to collect the data that is needed to understand what works, and to identify the risks and the issues that platforms pose to workers would be a second immediate concern that I would address in governance structures.
Wonderful. So with that, thank you to all of our panelists. I think, as the platform economy is increasingly becoming the standard architecture for economic transactions, this question of how do we incentivize businesses and platforms to take into account ethical considerations, establish new forms of employment relationships. How do we empower workers? How do we ensure that governments are able to stay on top of these unfolding trends, have access to data to inform their policy making? I think all of these are very central to how the world of work and how we're going to reshape work, in the 21st century, not just as technology advances and platforms proliferate, but also as, the world of work changes drastically in reaction to other forces. With that, I would like to thank all of my panelists, Jonathan, Clairy, Sai, Dovev. Thank you so much. Really a sense of gratitude to Reshaping Work and all of our colleagues there who have been working like magicians behind the scenes to make all of this possible. And for me, to all the participants, thank you very much for a rich discussion in a very short period of time. Thank you very much.